What is up, ladies and gentlemen? It's your boy Donald, and ow! It's Wednesday, and you know what that means? It's time for a win off. Yeah, I'm really tired right now. I'm not saying that I'm recording this at like midnight, but I'm pretty much recording this at like midnight. Cat. Hi, Tom. This is Tom Nathaniel Bobaniel. That is her full name. She's very excited. Fortunately for me, I got a little bit of a new setup, so she can't just knock the camera over easily like she might have been able to last week. Cat. Anyway, so this week's a continuation of last week. As I mentioned, if you haven't seen that, I'm going to put that somewhere on the screen right about now. Stop watching this one, go watch that one. I say watch, it's always a listen. But yeah, and since if you watch that one, you'll understand. Have you get right into it. Let's go.
Battlestaff, Part 2. Written by Jonathan Howe. Read for you by Daniel Howe. I'm not really a fan of Craig, Henry complained under his breath. Float hummed in agreement. It sounded more like words every day. In the years since Henry got picked up by last Wednesday, Float had grown impressively strong. They almost grew closer to a high-level Takashan spirit day by day. Craig was at the other end of the practice ground, shredding an epic solo that wasn't in the planned piece. It was throwing off Henry's fighting, and he didn't know what to expect from the music. Even Float, a being with magical relationship with song, had trouble following when Craig did this. Float hummed a warning for Henry, who dodged right. His opponent, Vanessa, had just thrust her lance into the place Henry had occupied moments ago. "How do you do that?" she asked. Henry brought his axe down to hook the haft of her weapon. He yanked, trying to disarm her. She let him pull until his balance was off before extricating her weapon. She wouldn't have been picked up as a lance wielder for a professional Battlestaff team if she could be disarmed so easily. "I'm just that good," Henry explained with a sly grin. "Also, I pay attention to the music." Vanessa furrowed her brows, shifting into a ready stance. "But Craig is being an idiot again. The music shouldn't be helping you." She threw out some short jabs to keep Henry at bay. I need to be more careful, he thought, scolding himself. Float hummed in agreement. Henry kept quiet about Float on purpose. He didn't know how common their relationship was. He parried another jab from Vanessa before swinging low with his axe. She leapt his blade, which he planned on, but then planted the butt of her lance in the ground and launched herself forward. He didn't expect both her feet taking him squarely in the chest. Henry grunted as he was flung backwards, axe flying from his grip. He rolled, flipping over and landing in a crouch. Behind him, Craig's playing was finally returning to the planned song. Henry rolled his eyes, but faced Vanessa. She took advantage of his lack of weapon, lunging forward, putting her all into an attack. Henry pushed the lance head aside, grabbing the haft again. This time, he faked a pull, putting one where Craig's song would indicate. Vanessa had anticipated a real pull, meaning she moved forward while Henry stood stiff. Her eyes went wide as she almost collided into Henry. He dropped, swept his leg under her, and took the lance in the air as she fell. Vanessa hit the ground and grunted as Henry pointed the tip of her own lance down at her. She laughed a bit before the halt whistle blew. Henry stood up her lance and reached a hand down to help her up. She took it and took her weapon back once on her feet. Henry scooped up his axe as they moved towards the center of the field where the captains and strategists waited. This is gonna be good, he thought. Captain Eric glared at him specifically. Strategist Beck flashed him an apologetic smile. "What did you do this time?" Vanessa said under her breath. "I didn't predict Craig's every stupid move, which lost me my axe." "Henry," Eric called. "If you would just fight alongside the bard's music, you wouldn't lose your weapon." Henry didn't even try to remind the captain that Craig hadn't been playing the allotted piece properly. They'd had this argument before. Float rumbled next to Henry, clearly displeased. "Sorry, Captain, I lost track of the song," Henry said, emotions in check. Beck smiled sadly, mouthing, "See me after." Henry trusted her more. She understood the sport. "Maybe if you listened to normal music, this wouldn't be a problem," Captain Eric scolded. Henry went cold. Everyone from squads A and B went silent, save one snickering Craig. Henry's fist balled up and he clenched his teeth. Still, he didn't say anything. "Captain," Beck said. Eric turned to look at her. They held gazes for a long moment before he shrugged and turned back to face the team. "That being said," he admitted begrudgingly, "good job in unarmed combat. Also, Craig, please note any changes you plan on making to the songs, save for vamping." "I was vamping," Craig complained. Henry almost barked laughter. That had not been vamping. He'd gone full off-script solo. "My statement stands," Eric said. "Everyone, take some time to cool down. Go home and get good sleep. Our meet is tomorrow, and we have good opponents." "That was ridiculous," Vanessa complained. Henry shook his head forlornly. "I've come to expect it." Eric clearly favors Craig. "But he's a terrible bard," she complained. "He's a great guitar player," Henry explained. "And Eric doesn't know the difference." Tyler, one of Squad A's shielders, leaned into their conversation. "So that's why you haven't played in a month?" Henry winced. "Yeah." Float buzzed their sound of annoyance. Eric's favoritism had prevented Henry from playing for all of last month. He disguised it as needing Henry to fight, but it didn't take a detective to see why. "That's stupid," Vanessa said. "I think you're a much better bard." "Agreed," Tyler seconded. "As does everyone on Squad A. Heck, if we didn't love Wendy so much, we'd have made you our bard ages ago." Henry smiled wanly. "Thanks, guys, but I'm fine. I've dealt with worse. Besides, team draft is coming up. Hopefully another pro team has been eyeing me for a trade," Henry said. The conversation moved on to lighter topics until the rest of their friends exited the locker rooms to join them. Craig was noticeably not part of the group. He was not well liked by the rest of last Wednesday. Beck was the last to join the small group. As everyone headed out to dinner, she moved directly to walk by Henry. "I tried to get him to punish Craig more," she explained, "but Eric is adamant." "Thanks," Henry said placatingly, "but I really am okay." She frowned, throwing him a worried glance as they walked. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "Henry, I'd rather you not get traded away. Aside from Craig and Eric, the rest of last Wednesday prefers you as a bard." "Then why am I not a bard yet?" he asked, a touch of spite in his voice. He knew the answer. They all did, but he needed to hear her say it. "Because Eric's dad is our team sponsor," she begrudged. "So nothing will happen to Eric or Craig. Beck, I really appreciate all your guys' support, but stop trying to keep me here. I only joined in the first place as my gateway into professional Battlestaff." Beck looked at him long and hard. Eventually, after a long, quiet minute, she responded. "Don't let two assholes stop you from having fun with the rest of us." Without waiting for a response, she walked faster, joining a different conversation. "Believe me," Henry thought, "I'm trying." Henry focused forward, humming a melody to himself. Float picked up the tune and began bobbing happily. Henry drummed the beat on his legs as he walked, starting the words quietly to himself. He could hear the rest of the instruments in his head while he sang. Float swirled, catching the attention of other spirits. Henry didn't notice what he'd done until his team slowed and he walked past them. His eyes unfocused on the horizon, and he glanced around, stopping his song. A veritable swarm of low-level spirits surrounded him. Even a few mid-levels spun in the bunch. "Don't stop," Tyler called out. The team cheered. Henry smiled sheepishly, continuing his song. He closed his eyes, allowing the feeling of the song to move through him. He let it pull his body. Henry started movements halfway between a kata and a dance. What was a kata if not a choreographed dance for martial artists? He continued to sing, leading the spirits through the song. They mirrored his movements, their power flowing into Henry. He felt the warmth and glow emanating from them. As the song climaxed, Henry singing for all he was worth, Float joined him in the motions. Float was most corporeal during song. Now the Takashin had a glowing humanoid body which it used to match and complement Henry's kata. The pair pushed and pulled. For every choreographed attack, there was a block, and vice versa. Float's humming joined Henry's voice, harmonizing. Henry smiled, finishing the song with his best friend. When the final notes faded, the spirits fled into the world. Float faded back into a slight change of air color only Henry could see. Then his team burst into cheers and applause. "That was incredible!" Vanessa called. Henry blushed, waving off the compliment. "I've drawn more spirits before." "You've done that before?" Tyler balked. Henry nodded. He'd been summoning groups of spirits with his song ever since he was little. Back then, Float had been a low-level Takashin that inhabited their family garden. "Do you summon a high-level Takashin each time?" Vanessa asked. "Float is—" Henry cut off quickly. "I mean, that floating spirit wasn't high-level, I don't think." Vanessa narrowed her eyes, but the clamor of the group stopped any further questions. "Guys," Beck eventually cut in, "are we going to dinner or not?" She guided the group down the sidewalk, giving Henry a break. Vanessa walked next to Henry, humming the chorus of the song he'd just sung. Henry didn't understand, but he smiled, watching Float twirl happily to the music. "We're facing the Might Rangers," Beck said grimly. All of Squad B groaned. The Might Rangers were undefeated, and for good reason. They had a killer bard who'd written their own theme song. "So what's the plan?" Craig asked. Eric cleared his throat. Everyone looked to him. "We aren't sure yet. Henry, did you bring your guitar?" Eric asked. The question caught Henry off guard. Yeah, he answered hesitantly. "Good," Eric said. "I want all our options open." Hope fluttered in Henry's chest. Even though he'd almost certainly lose to the Might Rangers, it would still be an opportunity to play. When the meeting finished, Henry walked directly up to Beck. "Did you tell him about last night? Am I going to play?" She pursed her lips in concern. "I did tell him. Still, I'm not sure what Eric is planning." Her words, filled with foreboding, quenched Henry's hope. He thought through all the ways Eric could use Henry playing as a bad thing. Confusingly, before they went out on the field, Eric informed them that Craig would be playing. Henry took the mild disappointment in stride. He'd been expecting something similar after speaking to Beck. What he didn't expect was Craig walking out onto the field with Henry's guitar. "What the hell are you doing?" Henry yelled. Craig didn't seem to hear, taking his spot on the field. Henry looked to Beck, whose eyes were wide. She moved to stop the match. She was too late. The start horn blared. The crowds went quiet as both bards started their songs. Before anyone else could start fighting, the bards would begin dueling. Their contest focused on pulling more spirits to their side. Craig was off to a bad start. His song was fine, but the bard of the Might Rangers was full swing into his intro, pulling dozens of spirits from the environment around. "Not much more I can do," Henry thought to Float. The Takashin made a sharp ringing noise. Was that a swear? Henry thought. Float hummed. Henry smiled. Same. Henry hefted his axe and took his place in the fray. Halfway through Craig's second run of the song, almost all of Squad B was down. Henry and Craig were the only ones standing. Understandable, seeing as the Might Rangers were incredible. Despite their clear loss, last Wednesday had a policy of no surrender until the bard was down. Henry fought a losing battle against a sword fighter and an axeman. The pair worked perfectly in sync, and the only reason Henry hadn't fallen was due to Float. The Takashin warned Henry of oncoming attacks, giving him unnatural reflexes. Behind Henry, the rest of the Might Rangers converged on Craig. He played continuously, dodging their attacks. Henry didn't have time to watch, needing to fight, but he could hear. Crack! Twing! Henry blocked an attack, then spun to face the noise. Behind him, Craig's playing had stopped. The bard had taken an attack head-on, knocking him to the ground. Henry's guitar laid broken beside Craig. "No!" he cried out, running in Craig's direction. The crowds roared, a mix of cheers and jeering. They believed he was trying to save Craig. Henry didn't give a damn about Craig. He ran by the opponents, ducking swings of their weapons. He scooped the remains of his guitar up and ran with them, leaving Craig to struggle on his own. Now the whole crowd booed, viewing his actions as cowardly. I don't care, Henry thought, tears forming in the corners of his eyes. He ran behind one of the pieces of cover given to all teams. He knelt, the pieces of his broken guitar in numb fingers. Why couldn't they just leave well enough alone? Henry thought. Float vibrated, a sound Henry had never heard before. Henry, Beck's voice came over his earpiece. You need to surrender. I'll deal with Eric and Craig after. No, she won't, Henry thought. She's not able to. Her voice came through again. They're all going to team up on you if you don't surrender now. Henry threw his earpiece away. Float pulled in closer, trying to spin around the pieces of Henry's guitar. Sorry, bud. There's nothing I can do about it. Henry closed his eyes, allowing tears to fall. With his eyes closed, Henry did the only thing he knew. He sang. The song was one of Henry and Float's favorites, a song of longing. The words spoken in Hinoese told the story of a man preparing to die, leaving a note for his friend. Is this really all there's left to me? The words of the dying man called out through Henry. He sang half-heartedly, music seeming like a far-off place. The sound of a weapon being raised caught Henry's attention. He looked up into the face of the Might Ranger's captain. Do you surrender? The woman asked. Henry opened his mouth to speak, but a feeling in his mind stopped him. Henry glanced around. Next to him, Float glowed. The Takashin pulled in power, more than Henry had ever seen the being do. What the captain said. Float reached out, taking Henry's axe in one hand and the broken pieces of his guitar in the other. Hands, Henry thought, as Float brought the pieces together. A flash of radiance blasted out of Float. When Henry could see again, Float was more substantial than ever. In their hands they held Henry's guitar, mended. It wasn't the same, but instead fused with his axe. Henry looked up at Float in awe. Gift, Float said, voice ringing out for all to hear. Henry reached out, taking the weaponized instrument in ginger hands. It felt right, as he pulled it into playing position. Thank you, Henry said, voice quiet. Float faded slightly, but Henry could still see them, more clearly now. A whooshing sound and Float's buzz alerted Henry to the danger. He rolled away, avoiding the strike. The captain of the Might Rangers stood, her sword at the ready. Henry pulled the strap of the guitar over his shoulders, keeping his eyes on the woman the whole time. I'll need to beat you, then? She asked, eyes narrowed. Henry smirked. You'll have to try. Henry plucked the strings. His song rang out, a slow start with melancholy tones. The captain made a face and then swung at him. Henry dodged, Float being his lookout. The slow part finished, and Henry played hard. He didn't have a backing, but he didn't need one. He had Float. The Takashin hummed along with Henry, making percussive sounds to drive Henry's song. The captain swung again and again, Henry avoiding every strike. On the final blow of a flurry, Henry parried with the axe edge. Then he began to sing. Last chance, Henry sang, the first words to the song. The captain's eyes went wide. Henry pushed back, spun in close and caught the woman in the side. She fell, knocked out by the strike. Henry continued to play and sing, looking around for other members of the Might Rangers. There should be 6 left, including their bard. The first thing he noticed was the swirl of low-level spirits. Second, he saw the stunned faces of the Might Rangers. All at once, they moved in. Henry played for all he was worth. The song wasn't just for winning. It was a cry of defiance in the face of Craig and Eric. It was a recompense for the mistreatment. Now they would see Henry triumph over the team that brought him down. He spun, blocked, and played his song. The members of the Might Rangers tried to flank him, but the swirl of spirits grew, causing wind to push them back. Henry moved into attack. Instead of needing to swing, Float struck out, knocking 2 members unconscious. Henry moved along, approaching the remaining 3 as the song calmed for a moment. The Rangers took the opportunity. They rushed in, swinging in a coordinated set of blows. Henry continued his song, knowing something they didn't. 30 seconds of dodging and the song began to come back. Henry played harder and harder until clang! A blow that was meant for Henry's chest was stopped by his team's shielder. The man stood, bruised and battered, protecting Henry. Henry faltered. "Play!" the man barked. Henry did. Behind him, one of the team's swordsmen stood. Bolstered by the end of the song, Henry and the remainders of last Wednesday fought. The final hit landed as the final note rang out. Henry stood, surrounded by fallen enemies and teammates. He only looked to Float. Outside of the battle, it was clear the spirit had grown beyond mid-level. "Thank you," Henry said. "Thank you," Float replied, voice crisp. Henry turned and bowed to the roaring crowd. "I'm kicking you out of last Wednesday," Eric said angrily. "I know," Henry nodded. He was already collecting his things. "That's it?" Eric spat. Henry nodded. Float vibrated angrily. "Actually, no, there is one more thing," Henry said. Float moved over to Craig's prized guitar and touched it. The instrument shattered into thousands of small pieces. Without another thought, Henry left. "Henry," Beck called out. "That wasn't a good idea." She ran to catch him. "I don't know what you mean," Henry said. "I didn't do anything." Her words faltered. She stammered. "Henry, you don't—" "Beck," he cut her off. "I want to leave." He met her eyes, trying to be reassuring. "Well then," a new voice said. "Want to join a team that appreciates you?" Henry and Beck turned to find a well-dressed man approaching. Henry shook his head. "I'll be making my own team, thank you," he said. The man shrugged. "I'd like to sponsor that team." Henry looked him up and down, unsure of the man's identity. "Do I have time to consider?" Henry asked. The man reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a business card. "As much as you need," he said, "within reason." Henry took the card and left, Float in tow.
And we're back. Yeah, so, Cat. No, this was just a continuation I wanted to do because I liked this character and this world and this idea of a sport that people used and like growing relationships with these beings that magic works through them instead of magic working through the people. It's kind of Stormlight Archive-esque. However, when I started imagining, I can't remember how my brother pronounces them. I call them Takashins or Tikashins. When I started imagining them, they really weren't like, they're kind of like Spren from Brandon Sanderson's thing in how they're forming, but like in my head, that's not what they are. And I think in full like reality, that's not, but there are some base level parallels you could draw. So that's something to consider. But I just liked how that's forming and the relationship there. No, it's not the same thing as like the Niall bond that Spren have with humans, and if you haven't paid attention to Brando Sando stuff, you're gonna be so horribly confused by everything I'm saying. It's fine, it's not a big deal. But Cat. Anyway, I'm tired, so I'm gonna go to bed. I hope you enjoyed it, and look out for, I think I'm planning on doing one more part to Henry's story next week. It'll be cool. I say one more part. I might bring up stuff later, but for the time being, that's all. Anyway, neat. Okay, bye.